Hi there, it's Mr. Clark. Welcome to Unit 6 on Counterpoint and Lesson 6.1.1, which is just an introduction to Counterpoint. Like, what is counterpoint? What is this funky word, and what does it mean? So, counterpoint comes from the Latin punctus contra punctum, point against point, which translates to note against note, and contrapunctum went to contrapunctus, which went to counterpoint. So that's the etymology of the word, where you have note against note. So it's talking about having two lines of music going on at once. Um, Specifically, two different melodic lines that work together well and form harmonies together. So that's what we're going to be looking at for this unit, how to have two melodic lines going on at the same time that sound good together. So for a while, specifically 1600s, 1800s, and continuing on to the present, the study of counterpoint was considered really important for composers. If you're writing a melody and a bass line, not just the roots, but like a melodic bass line, then you want the melody and the bass line to sound good together, and you want them to, you know, be fun to sing and be relatively independent and all of that. So the traditional method of teaching counterpoint is going through a series of types, either 4 or 5 different types, where I give you a line called the cantus firmus, or the fixed line, because, Latin is hip and cool. And you, as a student, write another line that sounds good with it. So I give you a melody, you write another melody that sounds good with it. Great. Today, a lot of the rules might seem kind of arbitrary, but there are historical reasons for them, and they all stem from these 3 points of counterpoint that are applicable to lots of different forms of music depending on how you define these sorts of things. So this is a cool graphic that I made in Microsoft Paint that I came up with while teaching. But I think that this really justifies a lot of the seemingly arbitrary stuff we're going to talk about. So the first point, it should be fun to sing. Things that are fun to sing are not. That's boring if you just stay on the same note the whole time. So it should move. It should have like da 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 da. It should have like a clear high point or low point, moving somewhere or coming from somewhere, rather than just kind of going da 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 da. No one wants to just move back and forth between two notes. That's not fun to sing. On the other side of the spectrum, singing lots of super difficult intervals like da da or no, da 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 da. That's no fun either. So kind of finding that sweet spot. A lot of steps, few skips, balance it out, that sort of thing. You want it to sound good, and that's very context dependent. For the 1600s to the 1800s, when this was being taught, there are certain intervals that were considered consonant that sounded good, and certain intervals that were considered dissonant that sounded bad. And we're going to look at those. At some point, I will have at least one more counterpoint optional unit up about Hindemith's counterpoint, and his idea of what sounds good is very different. There are various atonal composers that had theories of dissonant counterpoint, where you having dissonant intervals was explicitly allowed, what were traditionally considered to be dissonant intervals. So what we're going to look at this unit is more traditional, more in line with what white European men thought in the 1600s to the 1800s, but also applies to a lot of the folk music and folk tunes and modern popular music that we look at now. And then the last element is part independence. Because if you have two different melodies, you want them to sound like different melodies. If you just go, then that just sounds like you kind of harmonize the one line in parallel, and it doesn't sound like two different melodies. It just kind of sounds like one melody. So, oh no, lots of words. This is some important vocabulary that we're going to be using throughout the unit, so just going to go over it quickly. You'll probably want to refer back to this section. So, in terms of intervals, a step is going to be a major or minor second. This is also known as conjunct motion. Con versus dis. So conjunct meaning like next to each other. A skip would be a major or minor third because you have a note, then you skip a note, and then you get to your next note. Very fancy staff here. 2-line staff. Great, good. So we skip a note. That's why it's called a skip. This is one type of disjunct motion where they're not right next to each other. And then a leap would be any interval larger than a third, which is the other type of disjunct motion. So step, skip, and leap. These are melodic intervals. And then in terms of contrapuntal motion, which you'll have some practice with on our 2Z, it's referring to how the two voices move relative to each other. So contrary motion, if you're feeling contrary, you're going to do the opposite of what someone tells you to do. So one voice goes up while the other voice goes down. I'm drawing lines, but it would actually be like notes, something like that. One voice goes up, the other voice goes down. This is great for part independence. If the melodies are going in different directions, they're definitely not the same melody. Parallel motion would be moving the same interval in the same direction. Just like parallel lines in geometry class, not like parallel major and minor, because that's still weird and I don't know why that's a thing. But same interval, same direction. You can use this for imperfect consonances. You don't know what that is, that we're going to talk about it later down. Similar motion would be same direction but different intervals. So say they're both moving up but by different intervals, both moving down but by different intervals. And then oblique motion would be one voice remains on the same note and the other changes, either going up or down. That's fine, but you shouldn't overuse it, because again, if you have too many notes that are the same in one of the voices, then that gets boring and therefore not fun to sing. So last section here is just talking about some general principles that you'll have a lot more practice with. So just listen for now and worry about it later. So melodic intervals, as you recall from Unit 3 on intervals, hopefully, is that melodic intervals are horizontal intervals within a single line of music. You may always use steps. Steps are always fine. You can also use thirds, fourths, fifths, sixths, and octaves. What have we left out here? We have left out augmented seconds. Can't use augmented seconds. Those are hard to sing. Can't use the tritone. Tritone is terrible to sing. Can't use sevenths. Those are also pretty difficult to sing. So when you're writing melodies, you want to use primarily steps, few skips for variety. Larger leaps, not too many. It says here use at most one large leap per counterpoint exercise, maybe two depending on how long it is. And in general, you're going to want to approach it and leave it by step to balance that out. So like da 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 da. So I approached it by step, left it by step. Avoid using more than two skips or leaps in a row, again, primarily stepwise. Try to have distinct high and low points, because that makes it more interesting, more fun to sing. Include variety, again, fun to sing. Harmonic intervals are the vertical intervals formed between the two voices that you're writing. So you can use consonant harmonic intervals, which are diatonic, belong to the scale, first, or unisons, thirds, fifths, sixths, and octaves. Unisons, fifths, and octaves are perfect because they're perfect intervals. So you should definitely use them for the first and last note, sparingly in the middle. Don't really want unisons in the middle of your exercises. You're not allowed to have parallel perfect consonances. That's just not allowed because the perfect consonances are so similar that in terms of harmonic series and stuff that it would sound like a single melody versus sixths. Having a couple of those in a row is it's easier to tell them apart. So thirds and sixths, as I said, are imperfect consonances. You are allowed to have parallel imperfect consonances, but not more than three. And again, we'll go over all these detailed rules later. You're not allowed to use seconds, fourths, and sevenths yet. Try to keep your two voices within a tenth of each other. That's just so you don't have super wide intervals that are hard to hear. You want to start and end on tonic. That makes sense. Pretty much all of our melodies have done that. You want to approach tonic at the end stepwise. If you're in minor, you'll probably need to raise flev to sev at some point, like at the end. So if you're going sev 1 at the end, you can't go flick sev 1, you can't go flick sev 1, because flicks to sev would be an augmented second. We said, no, not allowed. So it'll have to be a regular 6. Right chromatic house, we'll worry about that later. Cool. Sorry for saying all these words at you. Go ahead, practice. I think there's some stuff on contrapuntal motion and some stuff on something else. And, oh yeah, consonant intervals. So, go practice that. We'll worry about the actual counterpoint next time.